And please correct my mispronunciation of your name if that is needed. But Nick Schwellenbach is a senior investigator at the Project on Government Oversight. He's previously been the communications director at the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, the main federal agency in charge of protecting whistleblowers. He also served on a three-person government team that evaluated whistleblower allegations of abuses of authority, violations of journalistic independence, and other claims involving the first Senate-confirmed CEO at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. He was POGO's Director of Investigations from 2010 to 2012 and from 2017 to 2019, an investigator from 2004 to 2008. His resume is extensive, and today he's here to talk about some of the challenges that may be resulting from the use of Border Patrol agents and combining them with ICE agents in some ways that, frankly, I think most of us are still trying to wrap our heads around. Nick, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the Lurie Daniel Favors Show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lurie. Yeah, I'm happy to be on, and I will try to help your listeners and help all of us try to understand these issues a little bit better. We recently published a story that I co-authored where we looked at Gregory Bovino,
Hmm.
who is the Border Patrol Commander at Large. This is the new title they've recently given him at the Department of Homeland Security. He's
Huh.
been leading these operations in Los Angeles, Chicago, most recently in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's supposed to be moving on to New Orleans soon. And these operations have seen extensive use of force against protesters, activists, migrants being pulled out of cars.
Wow.
Many of us have seen these videos
Yep.
over the last several months, and a federal judge recently called these actions in Chicago so shocking that they shocked her conscience. And that's a federal judge, and federal judges don't tend to use that kind of language.
Yeah.
So we looked at Gregory Bovino's track record using federal data, and this data comes from Border Patrol agents themselves. And the data showed that agents who've been led by Greg Bovino in recent years have used force far more often than anywhere else in the Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol is sort of notorious for many cases of alleged excessive use of force, but his agents that he has led are off the charts compared to the rest of the agency.
Ouch.
And you alluded to it in your comments just a second ago, but there's been reporting over recent weeks that immigration and customs enforcement, the old leadership in that agency, are increasingly being sort of shoved aside and replaced with Border Patrol officials like Bovino himself.
What's so interesting to me is that I've noticed that we don't often see a lot of reports about Proud Boy violent activities anymore. And it seemed like at a certain point, all we were hearing about were Proud Boys and those sorts of folk, swarming and engaging in roughhousing sorts of activities. And now the groups that we see engaging in those sorts of activities tend to be ICE agents, tend to be these sorts of official members of the administration. And the fact that they all wear masks, and it did, to me, it's a little just too on the nose. It's kind of like, why don't you ever see Hannah Montana and Miley Cyrus in the same place? Is that the one who does Jonah? Is that? Yeah. So they're the same person. Some people used to say there's a reason, like there are reasons why these folks feel very familiar and very similar. What do we know about Greg Bonvino? Is he a long-term part of the Border Patrol? Where did he come from?
So Greg Bovino has a pretty interesting history. He hails from North Carolina, a small town in North Carolina. He, from a very young age as a kid, aspired to be part of the Border Patrol. He read these very rosy pro-Border Patrol accounts written in magazines in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And there was a recent interview of his sister, Natalie Bovino, by the Daily Mail, where, she says, yeah, I mean, since he's been, I think, 11 years old, he wanted to join the Border Patrol. He even saw a movie about a Border Patrol agent in the early 1980s, starring Jack Nicholson, and was
Boy.
apparently upset, according to his sister, when it was revealed that the character Nicholson played was a corrupt Border Patrol agent.
Huh.
But he got a degree at Appalachian State University. He joined local law enforcement in North Carolina, served for 3 years, and then joined the Border Patrol in 1996. And his first job in the Border Patrol was in the El Centro sector of California. And I'll probably be talking about El Centro quite a bit. in this interview, but El Centro, or that sector, covers central. It's sort of the interior part of California.
Mm.
It stretches from a 70-mile stretch of the US-Mexico border all the way to the border of Oregon. It's one of the sleepier US-Mexico border patrol sectors compared to Tucson. There's not as much traffic there,
Mm.
but that's where he started his career in the Border Patrol, and he's served there for the last several decades. He's a career Border Patrol agent. He is not a political appointee, but he's been elevated by the current Trump administration into a very high level position where he can rove to these different operations across the country.
Huh. And under his leadership, if I'm reading your report correctly, we're seeing that under his leadership, for every assault they faced, says the report, El Centro agents have used force over 3.6 times. That's those are not good numbers for those of us who are peaceful, loving people. And it seems as though, if I'm following the news correctly, the images and the videos I've seen of him sort of encouraging the officers to really go around the law, focusing on arresting everybody in ways that are really troublesome just to see the video clips of. But if he's not a political appointee and this is sort of who he is and who he's always been, that to me, and please push back on this if I'm inaccurate here, it feels as though he has been groomed in some ways in a culture that maybe predated him. I'm going to say definitely predated him. But this sort of behavior being allowed to have someone like him shine in this moment seems to me like the problem isn't just necessarily him, but the culture of the Border Patrol generally.
Yeah, there's a couple things going on here, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. Is the Border Patrol is an agency that has sort of long been accused of using excessive force against migrants, typically in remote places, far from the public eye, far from journalists. There have been a lot of so to speak, he said, she said situations where a migrant said they faced abuse. The agent says it was justified, but up until recently, we haven't had a lot of video footage of it. The Border Patrol, up until a few years ago, didn't really widely use border body-worn cameras. That has started to change. But nonetheless, the Border Patrol is seen as an agency by many activists, many experts, even some insiders, as sort of an agency that hasn't really put a lid on abuses in its own ranks for decades. Now,
Hmm.
you take that and you pair it with an administration that is encouraging them to use aggressive tactics, not just on the border, but in deployments in major US cities, not
Right.
just against migrants, but against anyone who gets in the way. And sort of that's what you get is this very combustible situation that we've been seeing for several months. Now, I want to say that our investigation used official government data. And I will say that some of these anecdotal accounts of assaults against Border Patrol agents have led to court cases or attempts to prosecute people in courts. And some of those cases have collapsed. There was a case in LA where Bovino was the only witness on the government side to testify
Wow.
that another Border Patrol agent was assaulted. There was no video footage that clearly backed up what Bovino claimed, and a jury acquitted the man accused of assault, of charges of assault.
Wow.
So I would just want to say that as sort of like we're taking this data at face value, but there are reasons to question like the numbers. But
Hmm.
even with the government's own data, the agents under Bovino's leadership still are using force far more than they face assaults or alleged assaults, and far more than any other sector within the Border Patrol.
Now, in addition to official government numbers and other forms of data, as a Black woman who studies the history, one of the data points I bring to this is wow, this looks a lot like slave catching. My God, this feels like we're operating under the fugitive slave law approach to determining who gets freedom and who does not. And I've yet to see a real analysis that can push back on that framework. And one of the things that we often talk about, at least within my community, is the fact that the first police patrols were actually slave catchers. And that's sort of how this country came to understand what policing would look like. And because we now have a Supreme Court decision that has basically said, yeah, you can if they're speaking Spanish, if they're kind of brownish and they're at a work site and they've got, paint on their jeans looking like they're at work, yeah, that might be reasonable cause to suspect that somebody is not here legally. That's basically giving green light for racial profiling in ways that many of us warned about, but here we are. that feels like a very combustible mix that feels extraordinarily ancient American to the extent that America has ancientness that it can tap into. Is there something I'm not seeing that you are aware of that would make that analysis be off in some way?
No, no, and to be a bit more specific, the Border Patrol, its roots predate the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, go back to the
Mm.
1920s,
Oh,
and so the U.S. Border Patrol is a part of Customs and Border Patrol, sorry, Customs and Border Protection. That was sort of a post 9/11 creation along with the Department of Homeland Security. But DHS sort of took all these elements like the Border Patrol, like some of these legacy agencies like INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service. Some of these agencies got changed, some of them got mashed together. But the Border Patrol is sort of this pre-existing unit that goes back to the 1920s. And especially on the US-Mexico border, the policing of the border has long had a lot of there's been a lot of racial tensions, a lot of
right.
racism associated with the policing of the US-Mexico border. So it is not irrelevant whatsoever to bring sort of race into this, even up to the present day. And you were referring just a second ago to that Noam v. Perdomo decision that
Yeah.
from a few months ago by the Supreme Court. And basically, in that, it was not so much a decision, but the Supreme Court refused to block these tactics used by the Border Patrol, ICE, and other federal agencies that essentially amount to racial profiling.
Right.
The government's position was, well, someone looks Hispanic, they're speaking Spanish, they're at a Home Depot. Yeah, we can round them up and arrest them. We can ask them about their status.
Mm.
The plaintiffs in that case were U.S. citizens that were even telling federal agents, you know, we're not we're not in this country without authorization. We are legal citizens. So clearly, race was playing a role in the government's operations, and so it's a really dangerous what the Supreme Court did is the Supreme Court essentially gave the federal government sort of permission to keep using these tactics, didn't check the federal government's use of race as a factor. Now, it's very interesting because we've also had a Supreme Court in recent years struck down in the context of higher education any use of race as a factor.
Yep.
So, like in one context, they say you can't use race whatsoever as a factor for bringing people into higher education. But in the context of depriving people of their rights, sure, you can use race as a factor.
Well, that
So,
means to me you can only use race to be racist. Like if you're going to use race to be equitable, no, no, race is only to be used to be if you're going to be racist. But that generally aligns with my understanding of America writ large. Who is responsible for the Border Patrol? Like I know that if my local police department does something I don't like, I can go to the Civilian Complaint Review Board. There's a body I can at least go to where my concerns will be heard. Does that function exist for the Border Patrol? And if so, who is in charge of these people?
just to quickly summarize sort of the leadership of the Border Patrol. Well, we've got someone like Greg Bovino. He's still the chief of the El Centro sector, but he's also the commander at large of these sort
Jesus.
of roving Border Patrol operations. Then you have Mike Banks is the head of the Border Patrol, and then the Border Patrol is nested within Customs and Border Protection, which is led by Rodney Scott, who's another former longtime member of the Border Patrol.
Wow.
And then CBP is within the Department of Homeland Security, which is led by Kristi Noem. And above them in the White House, you have Stephen Miller, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor on Homeland Security. He's driving a lot of these aggressive operations in cities. He set this 3,000 a week arrest quota
Oh,
for DHS to arrest migrants. That's driving a lot of these aggressive operations. They're trying to like grab as many people as they can and arrest them. Many of them have turned out to be US citizens. Um, and you also have Tom Homan, who was accused of taking a $50,000 bribe in a kava bag several months ago
right.
in an FBI sting operation last year. So those are sort of the top key players here. But yes, like local police departments, there is an Office of Internal Affairs. It's called the Office of Professional Responsibility
Mm.
at Customs and Border Protection. They are sort of the main oversight body that is supposed to investigate accusations of excessive use of force, as well as, corruption, like taking bribes from drug traffickers or other types of misconduct by the staff at the Border Patrol.
Wow.
OPR has tried to be more transparent under the Biden administration. They, made a lot more data available. That's the data I used to do the analysis I did recently. But OPR, nonetheless, is still accused of often not finding problems where experts who look at the same facts find problems. Um, and they are almost entirely seen by everyone, including insiders, as taking far too long to do their investigations.
Wow.
Um, so they're one of the oversight players here. There's also the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security, which looks at very few cases of excessive use of force.
Mm.
And then you have the oversight committees in Congress. The two of the main ones are the House Homeland Security Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Right now, those committees are controlled by Republicans in Congress and are not conducting aggressive oversight of Border Patrol or ICE for these use of force incidents.
See, now when I compare this to the knowledge of the report, I believe it was the Department of Homeland Security back in maybe 2006, '07 under Janet Napolitano. I'm reaching now, but there was a report that they issued, which I believe they later had to retract under political pressure, that talked about the fact that white nationalists were viewing the militarized components of the American government apparatus as a wonderful source, not only for recruiting, but for training. That included police departments, it included all the military branches and agencies like Border Patrol. And it just seems to me if I wanted to be anti other, if I wanted to be able to brutalize and abuse people and get away with it, the Border Patrol might be a career I'd considered. Like it did, and I'm not hearing that there is a very at least effective way of pushing back against this. Do you have any insight on what we the people can do? Is there something that we the people can do other than I mean I've got ideas, but not everything should be shared on air. But what would you suggest that people should be doing if they're as concerned about this as I think we need to be?
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with that 2000. It was a 2009 report by an analyst at DHS where
Okay.
he said that these militant groups, including white nationalist, white supremacist groups, were targeting veterans of the military as well as other people in law enforcement for potential recruitment. And I did reporting a couple years ago based on a leaked Oath Keepers list where people, they put their phone numbers, their addresses, and they're also their employer or former employee or employer, sorry. And I identified over 300 people on this leaked Oath Keeper membership list who were either current or former DHS employees.
Oh.
Some of them were Border Patrol employees, and I even, spoke to a couple of them. And so it's a very real risk, and you're absolutely right. A lot of people in these extremist organizations have sort of viewed the border and have operated on the border as sort of fertile ground to do things,
Mm.
including violent activities. And there have been uh, journalistic accounts of the Border Patrol coordinating with these militia groups. A Mother Jones reporter named Shane Bauer went undercover with one of these groups many years ago, and he documented meeting with the Border Patrol while he was undercover with this militia. So it is not an academic concern. It's a very real concern.
Lord.
Um, the what can people do? I'm not here to tell people what to do, but people have been doing a lot. People have been documenting what's been going on directly with their own cell phone cameras or other cameras. People have been warning neighbors and other people in their community when they think there are concerning operations afoot. A lot of people have been reaching out to Congress to
Mm.
try to get Congress to do some oversight of these agencies. So there are a lot of things that are in the works by people, and people have been doing these things for months. A lot of the civil society organizations out there that have been monitoring the Border Patrol for years have been trying to document these problems, even predating this administration. So there are a lot of people trying to sort of check what they view as abuses and to try to prevent some of these things from happening. And when they do happen, publicize what's going on. There are also complaint channels that people can use, some of which I've mentioned. But the problem is, I think there's a lot of distrust or concern that these official complaint channels aren't working as well as they should be.
Mm. Which means we got a lot of work to do. I've been trying to keep a list of all the things that, as we rebuild the world, that need to change. This is going on the list, Nick. This is definitely going on the list. Thank you so much for this information. I know gathering the data and putting out these reports is a labor of commitment to the humanity of people, and so we appreciate you for that. If folks want to continue following your scholarship and your writings and other, whatever else you have to contribute to the world, what's the best way? Website or socials? What's the best way for folks to connect with you beyond these airwaves?
Oh, the best way would be to go to www.pogo.org/investigations.